The sound of rolling suitcases and soft airport announcements filled the air. People moved in every direction, some rushing, some strolling, as if they had nowhere important to be. In the middle of it all, she walked quietly, holding her small brown handbag close to her side. Her steps were slow and steady, but there was a tightness in her shoulders that made her look like someone trying not to fall apart. She didn't speak to anyone. She didn't even look around much. When the gate agent called for boarding, she simply handed over her ticket, gave a polite nod, and walked down the narrow bridge that led to the plane. Inside the aircraft, people were already settling into their seats. Some were taking selfies, others were talking loudly about vacations or business trips. The air smelled faintly of coffee and airplane fuel. She glanced at her boarding pass again. Seat 20D. An aisle seat. She walked down the rows until she reached it, carefully placed her bag in the overhead compartment, and sat down. She kept her hands clasped in her lap and stared at the screen in front of her. The people around her talked easily, laughing at small things, making space for each other's bags, passing smiles. She didn't join in. She just took a slow breath and tried to blend into the background. It wasn't that she disliked people. She just didn't have the energy for small talk anymore. The past few weeks had taken everything out of her. Her strength, her certainty, even her sense of direction. Sitting on this flight felt like running away, though she wasn't sure from what exactly. Maybe from a city that held too many memories. Maybe from someone who stopped trying to understand her. Maybe from herself. The flight attendants moved down the aisle, checking seatbelts and reminding everyone to switch off their phones. She did as told, quietly following every instruction. When the engines began to hum, she pressed her back against the seat and closed her eyes. The moment the plane lifted off, she felt a strange pull in her stomach. Not from the motion, but from the thought that everything familiar was now miles below her. The buildings, the streets, the people she used to see every day, all of it fading behind clouds. She had wanted to feel free, but instead she felt small. As the plane climbed higher, the chatter grew softer. People opened their screens, ordered drinks, or put on headphones. She kept staring out of the small window beside her, though she could only see the white blur of clouds. There was something calming about that view. No noise, no arguments, no explanations. Just silence. She thought about the morning before this flight. She had woken up before sunrise, unable to sleep. Her apartment had felt empty. The smell of coffee she made didn't fill the silence anymore. She had packed her things, slowly, folding clothes she didn't care about and leaving behind things. That used to mean something, a framed photo, a few books, a mug with chipped paint. She didn't want to bring any of it. It all reminded her of what she was trying to forget. When she locked the door behind her, it didn't feel like leaving home. It felt like walking out of a story that had already ended. A soft voice beside her broke the silence. "Excuse me, is this seat taken?" She looked up. A man stood beside her holding a jacket and a newspaper. His ticket was in his hand. She shook her head slightly, and he smiled politely before sliding into seat 20E, the middle seat. "Thanks," he said. She nodded and went back to looking at the window. For a few minutes they sat in silence. The man scrolled through his phone, then placed it in airplane mode. She could feel him glance at her once or twice, as if wanting to say something, but she kept her eyes averted. She wasn't in the mood for conversation. When the flight attendants began serving drinks, he ordered coffee. She declined. The smell drifted toward her anyway, strong and bitter, just the way she used to drink it. The hum of the engines became steady. She could feel the rhythm of the plane beneath her feet. Somewhere in the distance, a baby cried, then quieted down. The lights dimmed slightly. It was a peaceful kind of isolation, and for a while she was grateful for it. She took a deep breath and thought about what waited for her on the other side of this journey. Not much, really. A small rented apartment, a new city where no one knew her name, a job she hadn't even started yet. It was supposed to be a fresh beginning, but it didn't feel like one. It just felt empty. She reached for the small pendant, around her neck, a tiny silver circle, and turned it between her fingers. It was the only thing she hadn't taken off since everything changed. It reminded her of the person she used to be, the one who believed that life had plans and reasons. Now she wasn't sure of anything. The man beside her finally spoke again. "You don't like flying?" She turned to him, surprised by his gentle tone. "I don't mind it," she said quietly. "You just seem tense," he said, smiling slightly. "Sorry if that's rude." "It's fine," she said, glancing back at the window. "I guess I just have a lot on my mind." He nodded. "Yeah, same here." Something in his voice, a heaviness, made her glance at him properly for the first time. He didn't look nervous, but there was a tiredness in his eyes that felt familiar. Maybe he was running from something too. The conversation ended there, short and polite, but it lingered in her thoughts. As the plane continued across the sky, she noticed small details. The steady blinking of the wing light, the soft snoring. From someone behind her, the rhythmic footsteps of a flight attendant passing by. It was strange how quiet it could be in a space full of people. She opened the small window shade halfway, letting in a pale blue glow from the sky outside. The clouds stretched endlessly below like waves frozen in place. Somewhere up here it was always peaceful. No shouting, no traffic, no unfinished conversations. She almost wished the flight would never end. Hours passed slowly. She tried to sleep but couldn't. Her mind replayed moments she didn't want to remember. A hospital hallway, a phone call, a voice telling her something she never thought she'd hear. Every time she tried to push it away, it came back stronger. She bit her lip and focused on the sound of the engines, the faint vibration under her seat. It helped her stay in the present. Just a woman in seat 20D, somewhere between where she'd been and where she was going. When the flight attendants returned with meals, she shook her head again. "No, thank you." The man beside her took one and ate quietly. She appreciated that he didn't push conversation again. Sometimes silence was the kindest thing people could offer. After a while, she noticed him glance at her again. "Sorry," he said softly. "You just remind me of someone I know." "Oh," she said. "Good reminder or bad?" He smiled faintly. "Good." She was the kind of person who stayed calm even when everything went wrong. She gave a small nod but didn't reply. The words felt strange inside her, calm when everything went wrong. She wished that were true for her. The cabin lights dimmed again as most passengers drifted off to sleep. She remained awake, watching the faint glow of the wing outside. The darkness above the clouds was endless, but there was comfort in that too. For the first time in weeks, no one expected anything from her. She didn't have to be strong or brave. She just had to be there. Somewhere over the ocean, she finally leaned her head back and closed her eyes. The hum of the engines became almost like a lullaby. Her breathing slowed. In that quiet space, memories blurred into dreams, laughter in a kitchen, the warmth of a hand she used to hold, the moment she had to let go. Then a voice echoed faintly, through her half-sleep, a familiar voice saying, "You'll be okay." When she opened her eyes again, hours had passed. The cabin lights were dim and blue. Most people were asleep, faces turned toward the windows. The man beside her was reading, the light from his screen casting a soft glow on his face. She sat still, watching the faint light flicker across his fingers as he turned a page. The sound of the engines continued, steady as a heartbeat. It was strange, being surrounded by strangers, all heading somewhere different, all carrying stories no one else knew. Yet in that moment, she didn't feel completely alone anymore. Maybe because up here, everyone was in the same fragile space, between where they came from and where they hoped to land. She looked out the window one last time before closing her eyes again. The clouds were gone now. Below, she could see a stretch of dark water glinting faintly under the moonlight. It felt endless, but not as heavy as before. She didn't know what waited for her when she landed. Maybe it would still hurt. Maybe it would take time. But sitting there in 20D, in the quiet hum of the plane, she finally let herself breathe again. Slow, deep, and real. The morning light filtered through the cabin windows, soft and golden. The hum of the engines was steady, almost comforting. Most of the passengers were still asleep, wrapped in blankets, faces tilted against pillows. She sat quietly in 20D, her eyes open but unfocused, her thoughts drifting somewhere far from the plane. The man beside her was awake. He looked tired but alert, his fingers loosely holding a cup of coffee. When he noticed she was awake too, he gave a small nod. "Morning," he said quietly, as if not to wake others. She returned the nod, her voice soft. "Morning." He smiled politely and looked forward again. For a moment neither spoke. The silence between them felt calm this time, not awkward. After a few minutes he asked gently, "Long trip ahead?" She hesitated, then said, "Not really, just trying to get somewhere new." "New is good sometimes," he replied. "You get to start over." She looked at him properly for the first time. His eyes were kind, though a little sad. He looked like someone who had seen his share of hard days. There was something steady about him, though, like he wasn't afraid of quiet moments. "You travel often?" she asked. "Not lately," he said. "Used to. This trip isn't really by choice." She didn't press for details, but he went on anyway. "My father's in the hospital. Heart trouble."
They called me last night.
I booked the first flight I could find. Her heart sank a little. "I'm sorry," she said softly. He nodded. "Thank you. They said he's stable for now, but you never really know." She stayed quiet for a few seconds. "I understand," she said finally. "Hospitals have a way of making time feel heavier." He turned slightly toward her. "You sound like someone who knows that feeling." She gave a small smile, one that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Yes, I do." He didn't ask more, and she was grateful for that. The flight attendants began moving through the aisle again, offering breakfast trays. She accepted one this time. Scrambled eggs, fruit, a small bread roll. It wasn't great, but she was hungry enough not to care. They ate quietly, the soft clinking of utensils mixed with the low rumble of the plane. It felt strangely peaceful. Two strangers sharing a small meal thousands of feet above the ground. After breakfast, the man turned slightly in his seat. "If you don't mind me asking," he said, "what made you decide to leave?" She looked down at her hands. "Sometimes you reach a point where staying hurts more than going," she said. He nodded slowly, not pushing her for more. But the truth was she wanted to say it out loud, not for him, but for herself. "I lived in the same place for years," she continued. "Had a routine, a plan, a person I thought I'd spend my life with. But life has this way of changing without asking permission. One day everything felt familiar. The next day it didn't." He listened without interrupting. "I tried to fix things," she said. "Tried to hold on even when it was already gone. But eventually I realized I was just trying to save something that wasn't alive anymore." Her voice softened. "So I packed my things and booked this flight. I don't know if that makes me brave or just tired." He looked thoughtful. "Maybe both," he said after a moment. "Sometimes tired people make the bravest decisions." She smiled faintly. "Maybe." They sat in silence again, but it was a different kind of quiet, gentle, respectful. For the first time, she felt like she could breathe normally. The man leaned back in his seat. "Funny thing about flights," he said. "You sit next to a stranger, and for a few hours you share this tiny world. You talk about things you wouldn't even tell people back home." She nodded. "Maybe because we know it's temporary." "No expectations," he smiled. "Exactly. It's like being invisible and seen at the same time." She looked at him, considering his words. "Yeah, maybe that's why it feels safe." He sipped the last of his coffee, then placed the empty cup on his tray. "Safe," he repeated quietly, as if testing the word. "I haven't felt that in a while." Neither had she. Outside the window, the clouds began to break apart, revealing glimpses of deep blue sky. The sunlight filled the cabin, softening every edge. It was beautiful in a way she hadn't noticed before. "Do you ever wonder," she asked suddenly, "what would happen if the person you were supposed to become just never showed up?" He turned to her, surprised by the question. "What do you mean?" "I mean," she said, "we grow up thinking we'll become this better version of ourselves. Stronger, wiser, happier. But what if one day you realize you don't recognize the person you became?" He looked thoughtful. "I think everyone feels that way at some point," he said. "We all lose parts of ourselves along the way. But maybe that's not a bad thing. Maybe it's just life's way of making space for something new." His words stayed with her. She didn't reply right away. After a while, he leaned back and closed his eyes, resting his head against the seat. She turned back toward the window, letting her thoughts wander. She remembered long nights sitting alone, wondering if she made the right choices. She remembered the look in someone's eyes when they both knew it was over. She remembered how quiet the world felt after he left. But now, thousands of feet above the earth, she realized something. She hadn't thought about him since takeoff. Not really. Not with the same ache as before. Maybe that was progress, even if it was small. The flight continued smoothly. The attendants dimmed the lights again, encouraging passengers to rest before landing. She closed her eyes too, but her mind stayed awake. She thought about the man beside her. Not who he was, but what he represented. A reminder that everyone carries something. Everyone's fighting their own invisible storm. When she opened her eyes again, he was staring out the window. The clouds outside were turning gold, touched by sunlight. "Beautiful, isn't it?" she said quietly. "Yeah," he replied. "Makes you realize how small everything else is." She nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "And how short life is," he turned to her. "That's why you can't waste it," he said. "Even when it hurts." The words hit her deeper than she expected. Maybe because they sounded like something she'd needed to hear for a long time. For a while, they just sat there, both lost in thought. The intercom crackled, and the captain's calm voice filled the cabin, announcing that they'd be starting their descent soon. Passengers began stirring, stretching, gathering belongings. The calm moment started to fade into the noise of movement and chatter. The man beside her fastened his seatbelt and smiled. "Almost there," she nodded, though part of her wished the flight were longer. There was comfort in this in-between space. Not yet home, not yet gone. Just floating. "You ever notice," he said, "that sometimes strangers are easier to talk to than friends?" She smiled faintly. "Because strangers don't expect us to be okay," he chuckled softly. "Exactly." The plane began to tilt slightly as it started descending. The light outside turned softer, shadows moving slowly across their faces. He spoke again, his tone quiet. "I think you'll be fine, you know. You've already done the hardest part, leaving." She didn't respond right away. She wanted to believe him. Maybe one day she would. For now, it was enough that someone said it. When the plane finally touched down, everyone clapped softly, as people sometimes do when a flight ends safely. She smiled, a small, real smile this time. They waited as the rows ahead of them began to empty. The man gathered his bag and turned to her. "Good luck, and wherever you're going." "You too," she said. "I hope your father's okay." He gave a gentle nod. "Thanks. Maybe we'll end up on the same flight again someday." "Maybe," she said, though they both knew that was unlikely. He left first, disappearing into the stream of passengers. She stayed seated a little longer, staring at the empty seat beside her. Something about their conversation lingered. Not his words exactly, but the feeling of being understood, even for a short time. When she finally stood and reached for her bag, she noticed something under the seat, a folded piece of paper half tucked under his cup holder. She picked it up, assuming it was trash, but there were words scribbled on it in messy handwriting. It said, "Sometimes the smallest step forward changes everything. Don't stop now." She looked at the note for a long time, then smiled softly and tucked it into her bag. As she walked off the plane, the world outside felt wider, brighter. For the first time in months, she didn't feel like she was running away. She was simply moving forward. And though she didn't know it yet, the moment she sat quietly in seat 20D would become the turning point she'd remember for the rest of her life. The airport smelled faintly of coffee and rain. She stepped into the crowd, moving slowly through the wide, bright terminal. People hurried around her, calling loved ones, dragging suitcases, hugging relatives. It was the kind of noise that made her feel invisible, and she liked it that way. Outside, the city stretched beyond the glass walls, unfamiliar, but alive. She paused near a row of windows, staring at the morning light reflecting off parked planes. For a moment, she thought about the man from the flight and the note he'd left behind. She hadn't expected kindness from a stranger, and yet his words kept repeating in her mind. Sometimes the smallest step forward changes everything. She held on to that thought as she made her way to the taxi stand. The driver loaded her bag into the trunk and asked where she was heading. She gave him the address of the small apartment she'd rented online. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The city looked different from inside the taxi, fast, noisy, unfamiliar. People crossed streets in a hurry. Buses rumbled by. Shopkeepers opened metal shutters. She pressed her hand against the window glass, feeling the hum of the car beneath her palm. It was strange how life could move on so easily while hers felt paused. The driver talked casually about the weather and local traffic, but she wasn't really listening. Her thoughts were scattered, half in the present, half still in the quiet cabin of seat 20D. When the taxi stopped, she looked up at the small gray building in front of her. It wasn't home, not yet, but it would have to be. The hallway smelled faintly of paint and dust. Her new apartment was on the 3rd floor, one small room with a window facing the street, a narrow bed, and a kitchen that barely fit a table. Still, it felt peaceful. She placed her bag on the bed and sat down. The silence felt heavy at first. She wasn't used to this kind of quiet. No familiar voices, no background noise, just her own breathing. But soon she began to appreciate it. She unpacked slowly, folding her clothes into drawers, setting her pendant on the small table by the bed. When she opened her bag, the note from the flight slipped out and fluttered to the floor. She picked it up, read it again, and smiled softly. She placed it near the window where the light could reach it. Days passed quietly. She started her new job at a small medical clinic. The staff was kind, and though she didn't talk much, she did her work carefully. The patients came and went, some smiling, some worried, some in pain. Helping them gave her a sense of purpose again, something she hadn't felt in a long time. Evenings were quiet. She would sit near the window, watching the city lights flicker below. Sometimes she thought about calling the man from the flight, but she didn't even know his name. Maybe it was better that way. Some encounters were meant to remain memories. One rainy afternoon, about 3 weeks after she moved, she stayed late at work. The clinic had been busy, a long day of tired faces and small emergencies. As she locked the doors and stepped out, the streets glistened under the soft yellow glow of streetlights. She pulled her coat tighter and hurried toward the bus stop. The rain was light, almost soothing, and for the first time in a while, she felt calm. But life has a way of changing in moments when you least expect it. The next morning, she woke up early, made coffee, and opened the window slightly to let in the cool air. The world felt quiet again. She got ready for work, tying her hair neatly, slipping the silver pendant back around her neck. It had become part of her morning routine, something grounding. At the clinic, everything started as usual. Patients lined up at the front desk. The air smelled faintly of disinfectant and coffee. She moved through her tasks with quiet focus, checking charts, preparing rooms, and offering small smiles that felt more genuine now than before. Around midday, the waiting area grew busier than usual. A few people coughed, others looked restless. She could hear the sound of rain starting again outside, tapping softly against the glass windows. That was when it happened. A loud crash came from the hallway, a sound that made everyone turn. A man near the back of the room had collapsed. His chair had tipped over and he lay still on the floor. For a second, no one moved. The room went silent except for the sound of the rain outside. Then instinct took over. She ran forward. "Call emergency services," she shouted to the receptionist, her voice steady though her heart raced. She knelt beside the man and checked his pulse, faint but there. His breathing was shallow. People were standing now, watching, whispering. She tuned them out completely. Everything she had learned, every bit of training came back to her in that moment. "Sir, can you hear me?" she asked, gently tapping his shoulder. No response. She started chest compressions, counting under her breath, her movements quick and firm. Someone brought the emergency kit. She grabbed the oxygen mask and secured it over his mouth, trying to stabilize his breathing. The seconds stretched endlessly. A paramedic team arrived within minutes, but to her it felt much longer. When they took over, one of them looked at her and said, "You did the right thing. You probably saved his life." She stepped back, shaking slightly. Her hands trembled, but she didn't want anyone to see. She wiped them on her coat and took a deep breath. The man was being carried out on a stretcher, still breathing, though weakly. As the doors closed behind them, the room finally started moving again. People whispered words of relief. Someone thanked her. Someone else clapped softly, but she just stood there frozen. Her heart was still racing, but not from fear. From something else, something like clarity. All those weeks she had felt lost, unsure, invisible. Yet in that single moment she remembered exactly who she was. She wasn't just someone who ran away from pain. She wasn't just a passenger in 20D. She was someone who could make a difference, even in a quiet way. When her coworker placed a hand on her shoulder and said, "You were amazing," she managed a small, real smile. Later that evening, after the rush had ended and the clinic had quieted down, she stayed behind again. She sat by the window watching the rain fall. The city lights shimmered through the droplets, turning everything gold and silver. Her phone buzzed, a message from her supervisor saying the man was stable and would recover. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting out a long breath. She thought about how strange life could be. 3 weeks ago, she'd been sitting quietly on a plane, unsure if she'd ever feel useful again. Now, she had helped save a life. Maybe that was how change really happened, not all at once, but in quiet, unexpected moments. She reached for the small note she had kept near the window. Sometimes the smallest step forward changes everything. She read it again and felt tears gather in her eyes, but this time they weren't from sadness. The next morning, she walked to work in the cool air, a small smile on her face. The sky was clear after the rain and everything smelled fresh. People hurried past her, caught up in their own lives, but she didn't feel invisible anymore. She felt present. Inside the clinic, her co-workers greeted her warmly. Someone brought her coffee. The day went on, normal and steady, but everything felt lighter. During her break, she sat near the window again, watching cars pass by. She didn't know where life would take her next. Maybe there would still be hard days, maybe more quiet moments. But now she knew that no matter what came, she could face it. And though she didn't know it yet, the moment she stood up to help that man would set off a chain of events she could never have imagined. Moments that would connect her past, her courage, and the reason she had boarded that plane in the first place. For now, though she simply looked at the sky, her reflection faint in the glass, and whispered to herself, "I'm still here, it was enough." The next few days at the clinic moved quietly but felt different now. People smiled at her more, not out of politeness but out of respect. Word had spread about what she'd done that afternoon. A few coworkers even started calling her the calm one, because while everyone else froze, she had acted without hesitation. She didn't think of herself as a hero. She hadn't done anything extraordinary in her eyes, just what needed to be done. Still, every time someone mentioned the incident, a strange warmth rose in her chest. For the first time in months, she didn't feel invisible. One evening, she stayed late again to finish paperwork. The clinic was quiet, the lights dim, the faint sound of rain tapping against the glass. As she packed her things, she caught her reflection in the window. Tired eyes, soft lines of worry around her mouth, but also something new. Steadiness. She switched off the lights, locked the door, and walked out into the night. The air smelled of wet asphalt and rain. She pulled her coat tighter and started down the street. As she walked, she thought about the stranger on the plane again. His words still echoed in her mind. Sometimes tired people make the bravest decisions. At the time, she hadn't believed it. But now maybe he was right. A small step forward had changed something inside her. It wasn't dramatic, but it was real. She didn't feel stuck anymore. She felt alive. The following morning, she arrived at the clinic early. The receptionist smiled when she saw her. "There's someone waiting for you," she said. "For me?" she asked, surprised. The receptionist nodded toward the hallway. "The man from last week. The one you helped." Her heart lifted as she turned the corner. There he was, sitting in a chair near the window, looking stronger, color back in his face. When he saw her, he stood up slowly. "I wanted to thank you," he said, his voice soft but steady. "They told me what you did. I don't remember much from that day, but I remember your voice telling me to breathe," she smiled. "I'm just glad you're okay." He nodded, eyes glistening. "The doctor said if you hadn't acted so fast, it could have been worse. You saved my life." She didn't know what to say. It felt strange hearing those words out loud. She wasn't used to being someone who made such a difference. He handed her a small paper bag. "My daughter insisted I bring this," he said with a chuckle. "She baked cookies. Said it's the least we can do." She laughed softly, taking the bag. "Tell her thank you." As he left, she sat down on one of the chairs, holding the little bag of cookies in her lap. She felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Gratitude for her own courage. That night, she went home and sat by the window again. The city outside was alive with light. She brewed tea and opened one of the cookies, still smiling at the thought of that man and his family. Then, as she stared at the clouds above the city skyline, another thought came to her. How one quiet seat on a plane had started all of this. That memory came back vividly. The hum of the engines, the steady rhythm of the flight, and that small note she'd found under the cup holder. Don't stop now. She hadn't. And because she hadn't, everything was different. Weeks passed. Her days began to settle into a rhythm again. She laughed more easily now, talked to her co-workers during lunch, and even joined them for coffee on Fridays. The heaviness that had once followed her everywhere seemed to lift a little more each day. One afternoon she was sorting supplies when the receptionist called her name. "You have a call," she said, handing over the phone. "Someone from the hospital." She took it, confused. "Hello?" "Hi," a woman's voice said. "I hope this isn't strange. I'm calling on behalf of one of our patients. He said he met you on a flight a while back. He just wanted to let you know his father made a full recovery." She froze for a moment. Her chest tightened. The stranger from seat 20E. She hadn't expected to ever hear from him again. "Oh," she said softly. That's good news. He also asked me to tell you thank you," the woman continued. "He said your conversation on that flight helped him more than you realize." She smiled, eyes glistening. "Please tell him I'm glad he reached out, and I'm happy his father's okay." After hanging up, she stood still for a long time. The clinic around her buzzed with quiet movement, but she barely noticed. All she could think about was how life had found a way to connect her to people she thought she'd never see again. It felt almost like the universe had been whispering to her all along, pushing her forward, reminding her that she wasn't alone. That night, she walked home slower than usual, noticing small details she often overlooked. The reflection of lights in puddles, the sound of laughter from a nearby cafe, the warmth of the evening air. Everything felt sharper, more real. As she reached her apartment building, she paused before going inside. Across the street, an old woman was struggling with grocery bags. Without thinking, she crossed over and helped carry them up the steps. The woman thanked her repeatedly, and she smiled, brushing it off as nothing. But walking back to her own door, she realized something simple but true. Kindness had a way of multiplying. Maybe that was what the man on the plane had meant all along. One small step forward really could change everything. That night, sleep came easily. Her dreams were peaceful, full of faces she'd met and helped, moments that once felt meaningless now shining with quiet purpose. The next day, the clinic was busy again, but she felt steady through it all. When things got hectic, she would pause and take a deep breath, just like she had on that plane. In the afternoon, one of the younger nurses pulled her aside. "Can I ask you something?" she said shyly. "How do you stay so calm when things go wrong?" She thought for a moment before answering. "Because I've seen what happens when you stay still long enough to breathe. You find clarity in the middle of chaos." The younger nurse nodded thoughtfully. "I hope I can be like that one day," she smiled. "You will be. Just don't stop moving forward even when it's hard." That evening after work, she decided to visit the park near her apartment. The air was cool, the sky soft with the colors of sunset. Families walked dogs, children played on swings, people laughed over coffee cups. She sat on a bench and watched them, feeling the steady rhythm of life all around her. For so long she'd thought her story had ended when everything fell apart, but now she understood. It had only changed direction. She looked up at the sky, the fading sunlight painting it gold and pink, and whispered quietly, "Thank you." It wasn't to anyone in particular. Maybe to the stranger in seat 20E. Maybe to the man whose life she'd helped save. Maybe to herself. In that quiet moment, surrounded by strangers, she realized something simple yet powerful. Life wasn't about avoiding pain or running from the past. It was about finding meaning again, even in the smallest things, a conversation, a note, a choice to act when others freeze. A few drops of rain began to fall, soft and light. She didn't move. She just tilted her face toward the sky and let it happen, smiling faintly. It was strange how something so ordinary could feel like a blessing. The streetlights flickered on, glowing softly. She sat there until the rain stopped, then stood and started walking home, her shoes making gentle sounds against the wet pavement. Inside her apartment, she placed her bag down, brewed a cup of tea, and glanced toward the window. The little note was still there, faded now but readable. Sometimes the smallest step forward changes everything. She traced the words with her fingers and whispered, "It really does." She didn't know what would come next, but she was no longer afraid of the unknown. She had learned that life could fall apart and still find its way back to something beautiful. And somewhere, high above the clouds where it had all begun, a plane's faint trail disappeared into the evening sky. Quiet, steady, and full of possibility.